The air inside St. Augustine's Cathedral shimmered with light, stained glass windows casting jeweled patterns across rows of polished pews. The scent of lilies, roses, and old incense lingered, clinging to the vaulted arches like a prayer. Guests leaned forward in hushed awe, their murmurs fading into silence as the heavy oak doors opened, and Isabella Hart appeared on her father's arm. She was radiant. The ivory gown clung to her frame with elegant grace, pearls and lace whispering of heritage and tradition. A delicate veil softened her face, but not enough to hide the glow that seemed to radiate from her skin. Every step she took felt like stepping into the life she had always dreamed of. Her heart thudded with joy, though beneath that joy a secret pressed close against her, a secret only she carried. 3 months into her pregnancy, she felt her hand twitch with the instinct to touch her stomach, to remind herself she was not walking alone. Adrian's child, the symbol of their love, rested there like a sacred promise. Adrian Cole stood waiting at the altar. Tall, refined, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit of midnight gray, he looked like the storybook groom. His dark blonde hair caught the cathedral lights, his sharp jawline set in seriousness that Isabella mistook for emotion. She smiled softly, hoping it would draw out the warmth she knew so well. For months he had promised her forever. For weeks he had kissed her belly and whispered to their child about the life they would build. For days he had told her this day would be perfect. Her heels clicked softly on the rose-petal-strewn aisle, each step carrying her closer to her future. She thought of their home, of laughter echoing in hallways, of tiny hands reaching up to them both. She thought of the security Adrian's wealth provided, the name that would shield their child from whispers of scandal. By the time as she reached the altar, her eyes glistened with hope. The Reverend opened his worn book, his voice deep and reverent as he welcomed the congregation. A holy stillness filled the cathedral. Then, just as the words of union began to form, Adrian lifted his hand. "Wait," he said. The sound echoed like a hammer against glass, shattering the silence, startling the Reverend, freezing Isabella mid-breath. Adrian stepped back from her, his expression tightening, his hazel eyes shifting nervously toward the front row. A ripple of unease moved through the crowd. Whispers rustled like restless leaves. Isabella's fingers tightened around her bouquet, her knuckles whitening. "I can't do this," Adrian said, his voice louder now, carrying to every corner of the vaulted ceiling. Gasps rose around them, sharp, disbelieving. "I can't marry you, Isabella." The words ripped through her chest. For a heartbeat she thought she had misheard, that perhaps he had faltered under pressure. But then he turned, and his gaze fell on a woman in the front row. She was petite, blonde, draped in sapphire silk. Her blue eyes gleamed with something that looked less like shock and more like triumph. "She's the woman I love," Adrian continued, his voice trembling yet resolute. "Celeste Monroe is my true bride." Isabella's bouquet slipped from her hands. White petals scattered across the marble steps like snow crushed underfoot. Gasps erupted, whispers turning sharp, hungry for scandal. Some guests pitied her, others leaned forward eagerly, savoring the drama. But beneath the roar in her ears, Isabella caught something else, soft, urgent murmurs from Adrian's parents in the front pew. She heard the words, inheritance, debts, the Monroe fortune. This wasn't love. This was desperation wrapped in betrayal. Adrian wasn't just leaving her, he was selling himself, and in doing so discarding her like some thing disposable. Her stomach twisted. Inside, her child stirred faintly, reminding her that she was no longer just one broken woman. She was a mother, a protector. Her knees trembled, but she refused to fall. Slowly, she straightened her spine, her face a mask of quiet defiance even as tears threatened to break. She placed a trembling hand over her abdomen, a subtle gesture of ownership, of strength. The cathedral buzzed with gossip, phones raised to capture the scandal. But Isabella stood there in her ruined gown, heart torn open, pride bleeding, and made a silent vow. They could strip her of her fairy tale, but not her dignity. They could humiliate her, but they could not break her. As Adrian reached for Celeste's hand, Isabella turned away. Her heels clicked against the marble as she walked down the aisle she had entered minutes ago, not as a bride, but as a woman newly awakened. Every step she took burned with grief, but under the grief smoldered something fiercer. This was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of a war she hadn't chosen, but would surely survive. The morning after the cathedral betrayal, Savannah woke with the quiet murmur of bells and sunlight spilling across cobblestone streets. But inside Isabella Hart's chest, there was only ruin. She had not slept. Her gown, torn and stained with wilted petals, still lay crumpled on the chair beside her bed like a ghost that refused to leave. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Adrian's face, heard the words he had spoken before hundreds of witnesses, words that shattered not only her heart, but the life she had been preparing to build. The newspapers did not wait. By dawn, her shame was printed in bold letters across the front page. Bride left at the altar as groom chooses another woman. She knew everyone in the city would read it over coffee and whisper her name with either pity or cruel amusement. Some would say she deserved it, that she was foolish to believe in fairy tales. Others would feast on the scandal like vultures. Her grandmother Eleanor found peace. Either sitting at the kitchen table, eyes hollow, hands trembling around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. The older woman's face, lined with years of struggle and survival, carried no judgment, only fierce sorrow. "You are still breathing, child," she said quietly, "and as long as you are breathing, no man's betrayal can end your story." Isabella pressed a hand to her stomach. The child within was a small flicker of life she had not yet told the world about, a secret that made her humiliation even sharper. She had believed Adrian's promises, had given him all of herself, and in return he had turned their love into a spectacle of shame. But as her palm rested against her belly, she felt the faintest whisper of determination. She was not alone. Across the city, in a penthouse that overlooked the harbor, Damian Knight stood by the window scanning the same newspaper headline. His jaw tightened, gray eyes dark with a storm no one else could see. To the world, he was a billionaire investor, a man of ruthless intelligence and quiet power. But to himself, he was something far more vulnerable. He was the boy who had once watched Isabella laugh in a sunlit garden, the man who had carried his love for her in silence for years. He had seen Adrian woo her with polished charm, and he had stepped aside, believing her happiness mattered more than his longing. Now he watched her humiliation splashed across the front page, and his silence felt like betrayal. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered that Adrian had been forced to choose Celeste Monroe because of debts hidden by his family, that the Monroe fortune had been dangled as salvation. Others claimed Adrian had never truly loved Isabella, that she had been nothing more than a stepping stone. The truth twisted itself in shadows, impossible to separate from lies. But Damian did not need rumors. He had seen enough to know Isabella had been and wronged in a way no woman should ever endure. That night, Isabella heard footsteps outside her small house. She froze, heart pounding, then opened the door to find a package on the steps. Inside was a single white lily tied with a black ribbon, and beneath it a card with only 2 words written in bold script, "Stand strong." She looked up and down the empty street, but saw no one. The neighbors' windows glowed with lamplight, and a storm was rolling in from the coast, but the street itself was deserted. For the first time since the altar, she felt a strange prickle of suspense. Someone knew. Someone was watching her. She held the lily in her hand, the flower trembling as lightning split the sky, and she realized the world had changed. Adrian had destroyed her future, but another path was opening before her. A path laced with danger, mystery, and perhaps a kind of protection she could not yet understand. Her grandmother touched her shoulder and whispered, "You are not finished, Isabella. Not by a long shot." Isabella stared into the storm clouds and felt the truth of it. The man who had humiliated her might think she was broken, but she was only beginning to rise. The storm that swept over Savannah that night seemed to echo the turmoil in Isabella's soul. Rain battered the windows of her grandmother's house, lightning forked across the sky, and each thunderclap rattled the fragile calm she tried to hold together. She sat awake by the flickering lamp, her hands curled protectively around the swell of her stomach. Somewhere in the darkness of the city, her name was on every tongue, her disgrace fueling gossip, her pain becoming entertainment for strangers. Yet beneath the weight of humiliation, something fierce stirred. By morning, the storm had passed, but the city had not forgotten. As Isabella walked down the street to the market, heads turned. Some eyes were sympathetic, others sharp with curiosity, and a few were cruel, amused. Whispers followed her like shadows. That's her. The bride he left, the one he threw away. She kept her chin high, but inside each murmur was a blade. She wanted to scream that they knew nothing, that she carried within her a reason to keep living. But secrets had power, and for now, her child's existence was hers alone to guard. That evening, a sleek black car stopped at the corner of her street. From behind lace curtains, Isabella watched a tall figure step out, his movements deliberate, his face hidden in the gathering dusk. He did not approach the house. Instead, he spoke briefly to a driver, then disappeared into the shadows as if he belonged to them. Minutes later, another package appeared on her doorstep. This time it was not a flower, but a small velvet box. Inside rested a silver pendant shaped like a shield. No note, only silence. Isabella's grandmother warned her not to trust gifts without a name. Yet Isabella felt no fear when she touched the cool silver. Instead, a strange comfort swept through her, as if someone unseen had chosen to guard her at her weakest. She pressed the pendant against her skin and whispered a promise to the child she carried. We are not alone. Miles away, Damian Knight sat in his study, the fire casting long shadows across shelves of leather-bound books. His assistant reported that the pendant had been delivered, that no one had seen his presence on the street. Damian said nothing for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the flames. To protect her, he had to remain invisible. To reveal himself now would risk driving her further into the harsh gaze of society. But how long could he remain in the shadows while she carried a burden meant for two? As the weeks passed, Adrian and Celeste paraded their union across Savannah. They attended charity balls, smiled for photographs, and painted themselves as the golden couple of high society. But behind their polished smiles, cracks appeared. Whispers of unpaid debts grew louder. Rumors of Monroe family influence controlling Adrian spread in hushed conversations, and still Isabella endured, quietly building strength in the small corners of her world. One night she returned home to find the lock on her door scratched, as if someone had tried to force their way inside. Her grandmother rushed to her side, but Isabella stood frozen on the threshold, the silver pendant cold against her skin. Someone was trying to frighten her, perhaps silence her. Fear clenched her chest, but anger followed quickly. They had taken her wedding, her name, her dignity. They would not take her safety, or her child. Across the street, a figure lingered under a lamppost, tall and unmoving, the brim of his hat shadowing his face. When Isabella's eyes met the silhouette, he turned and walked away, vanishing into the night. She should have been terrified, but instead a shiver of suspense and strange reassurance mingled inside her. Whoever watched her was not her enemy. He was keeping the darkness at bay. Isabella closed the door, slid the bolt into place, and whispered to her grandmother that they were being protected by someone powerful. Eleanor only nodded, her old eyes reflecting secrets she did not yet speak. The world thought Isabella Hart had been broken at the altar, but in the silence of her home she was beginning to understand something more dangerous than heartbreak. She was being drawn into a game of power and shadows, where betrayal was currency, secrets were weapons, and somewhere in the unseen corners of Savannah, a man of immense wealth and hidden devotion was preparing to step into her story. The weeks that followed grew heavier with tension, as if the city itself carried secrets too sharp to remain hidden. Isabella noticed the change first in the way neighbors avoided her eyes, the way conversations halted when she entered a room. At the market, whispers swirled that Adrian's new engagement to Celeste was not a love story at all, but a desperate bargain. The Monroe family had the money to cover his father's crumbling empire, and Adrian had been bartered like property. Isabella should have felt vindicated, but instead the knowledge deepened her unease. If Adrian had sacrificed her to save himself, what else was he capable of discarding? The answer came one cold evening when a letter arrived at her grandmother's house, sealed with the Cole family crest. The words inside were venom. End the pregnancy. Quietly. Disappear from Savannah and you will receive a monthly allowance to keep you comfortable. Defy us and you will regret it. Her hands shook as she read, not from fear but from fury. They thought her child was a stain to erase. They thought money could silence her. She folded the letter, pressed her palm against her stomach, and swore aloud that no one would decide her child's fate but her. That night, the shadows around her home grew thicker. She heard footsteps outside again, the scrape of gravel, the whisper of movement that vanished when she peered through the window. The pendant Damien had given her seemed to pulse against her skin, a silent reminder that she was not entirely defenseless. Still, her heart raced each time the boards creaked under her feet. Meanwhile, Damien Knight sat in the back of his car, watching from a distance as the house lights dimmed. He had received the same information his private investigators uncovered the letter sent by Adrian's family. Rage burned in his chest, but rage was dangerous if used without precision. He had built his empire by striking only when certain of victory. Protecting Isabella required the same patience. But patience frayed when he saw her walking alone through the marketplace, head bowed against the stairs, her hands curled protectively over her stomach. One afternoon, Isabella returned from town to find her grandmother speaking quietly with a tall man in a charcoal coat at the edge of their garden. His face was half in shadow, his voice low, but Eleanor's eyes softened with unusual trust. When Isabella called out, the man tipped his hat, murmured something she could not hear, and disappeared down the path before she reached them. Who was that? Isabella demanded. Eleanor hesitated, then said, only someone who knows what danger really looks like. The unease sharpened that night when her window rattled with a thrown stone. She rushed to the porch and found a crude note tied to it. Leave Savannah or you will never know peace. Her blood went cold, but before panic could consume her, she saw movement at the corner of the street. A man stood there, tall and silent, the glow of the lamplight glinting against eyes that seemed fixed on her alone. He did not move closer, did not speak, but the threat of the note seemed smaller under the weight of his gaze. Isabella closed the door, heart hammering. Whoever haunted the shadows was more than a stranger. He was a force threading through her life with deliberate purpose. Protection or danger, she could not yet tell. But one truth grew clearer with each passing day. Adrian and his family were not finished with her, and the city's cruel whispers were only the beginning. In the silence of her bedroom, Isabella whispered to her child that she would fight until her last breath. What she did not know was that in another part of the city, Damien was whispering his own vow, that the woman who had been left bleeding with shame at the altar would one day stand taller than those who had tried to break her, and he would risk everything in the shadows until the moment came to step into her light. The storm came without warning, rolling over Savannah with a fury that shook the windows and drenched the cobblestone streets in rivers of rain. Isabella clutched the edge of her grandmother's kitchen table as pain ripped through her body, sharper than any humiliation she had endured at the cathedral. The child had chosen this night to arrive, and the heavens seemed determined to mark the moment with thunder and fire. Her grandmother Eleanor rushed to her side, calm despite the chaos. Hold on, child, she urged. Breathe with the rhythm of the storm. But Isabella's cries drowned against the roar of wind. Sweat poured down her brow, her nails dug into the wood, and every contraction felt like war. Outside, the storm battered the city, flooding streets, toppling branches and silencing all but the bravest footsteps. Yet one man braved the rain. Damien Knight stood across from the small house, water soaking his tailored coat, gray eyes locked on the flickering lights within. He had received word from the doctor he discreetly paid to check on Isabella in secret. Tonight was the night. The child was coming, and so too was danger. For days, Damien's investigators had reported suspicious movements near Isabella's street. Strangers lingering too long, a carriage following her through town, notes left at her doorstep. Adrian's family wanted the child erased. To them, Isabella's unborn baby was not blood, but threat. And Damien knew storms created perfect cover for desperate men. Inside, Isabella screamed as another contraction tore through her. Lightning illuminated her face, pale yet fierce, her hands trembling yet determined. She whispered to her unborn child between sobs, "You will come into this world knowing you are wanted. You will never doubt it." The front door rattled suddenly. Eleanor froze. The doctor was not due yet, nor had anyone been summoned. The storm howled outside, masking footsteps, masking intent. The lock trembled again, harder this time, and fear ripped through the small house. Eleanor moved to block the door, but Isabella cried out another plea of pain, pulling her back. Then the sound of a scuffle erupted outside. A muffled shout, the thud of boots in mud. Silence, followed by a heavy die collapsing onto wet earth. Moments later, the door burst open, not with threat, but with a figure whose presence filled the room like an unspoken vow. Damien Knight stood there, drenched from rain, eyes blazing with a protective fire Isabella had never seen before. Behind him, two men lay sprawled in the mud, groaning. Their attempts to break in ended with brutal efficiency. Damien's voice was low and steady as he spoke to Eleanor. "Bolt the door. No one enters this house unless I allow it." Isabella stared through tears of agony, her mind spinning between pain and confusion. Damien Knight, the man of whispers and shadows, was standing in her doorway like a storm-given flesh. She had seen him only from a distance at Adrian's parties, a man who never sought attention, a figure others spoke of with both respect and fear. Now he was here, commanding the night as if it bent to his will. Another contraction tore through her, and she cried out, clutching her stomach. Damien moved instantly, kneeling at her side, his wet hands steady as stone. His voice softened, stripped of the steel he had shown moments before. "Isabella, you are not alone. Breathe. You are stronger than this storm." Hours blurred into an eternity of pain and thunder until at last a sharp cry pierced the night. A child's cry, fierce and unyielding. Isabella collapsed back against the sheets, tears streaming down her face as Eleanor placed the tiny swaddled body into her arms. A daughter. Small, perfect, her cries echoing like defiance against the storm that had tried to swallow them. Isabella whispered the name through trembling lips, Aurora, a light born from darkness. Damien stood back, his chest rising with the weight of emotions he had hidden for years. The sight of Isabella holding her child struck him with a force greater than any business victory, any empire built. He had watched her suffer, watched her endure betrayal, but now she shone with a strength that humbled him. Isabella looked up, her eyes locking on him. "Why are you here?" she asked weakly. Suspicion and gratitude tangled in her voice. Damien hesitated. "Because storms attract wolves, and I will not let them reach you." His voice was quiet, but carried the weight of an oath. Isabella turned back to her daughter, but her thoughts churned with new unease. The storm outside was easing, but inside another one was just beginning. For the man who had appeared from the shadows tonight was not a stranger. He was something more dangerous, more mysterious, and perhaps more necessary than she could yet understand. The storm had passed, but Savannah awoke, whispering. News traveled faster than the river tide, and by morning the city buzzed with rumors. Adrian's discarded bride had given birth, some said. Others swore men had been found beaten in the mud outside her home. Nobody knew the whole truth, but everyone spoke her name again. Isabella Hart. Inside the small house, the world had shifted. Aurora's cries filled the rooms, fragile yet powerful, reminding Isabella with each sound that she had something worth fighting for. Her grandmother Eleanor moved quietly about, boiling herbs, whispering prayers, but it was the presence of Damien Knight that unsettled the air. He had not left after the storm. He remained, standing watch by the door at night, arranging for guards to linger unseen on the street, making calls from the shadows that kept trouble at bay. Isabella didn't know what unsettled her more, that he was there or that his presence brought her comfort. She would wake in the night to find him in the corner chair, his gray eyes reflecting firelight, his stillness like a promise. He was not family, not friend, not lover, yet he had stepped into her battle without hesitation. On the third day, he finally spoke the words she had been waiting to hear. "You are not safe. Adrian's debts are deeper than anyone knows. His family sees your child as a threat to what remains of their empire. They will not stop with notes and broken locks. Isabella stiffened, clutching Aurora tighter. And what are you then, protector or prison? Damien's eyes softened, though his voice remained steady. Protector, if you allow it. Her heart rebelled against trusting him. Men had lied to her before, wrapped promises in silk and left her bleeding. Yet there was something different in Damien's silence, in the way he looked at her, not with pity or hunger but with a kind of reverence, as though she carried not shame but something sacred. By the end of that week, an invitation arrived at her door. Embossed in gold, addressed in perfect script, it was for Adrian and Celeste's grand engagement gala. A spectacle designed to flaunt their union before the same society that had witnessed Isabella's humiliation. Eleanor urged her to burn it, but Damien studied the envelope for a long time, then said quietly, "Go." Isabella stared at him in disbelief. "Show them you are not broken. Show them you are not their victim." The thought terrified her, yet a fire flickered inside. She had walked out of a cathedral carrying shame and a secret. Now she could walk into a ballroom carrying truth and defiance. The night of the gala, carriages lined the street outside the Cole estate. Laughter spilled from crystal-lit windows. Inside, chandeliers glowed over silk gowns and black suits, champagne glasses clinked, and the air hummed with wealth and cruelty. Adrian stood tall at the center, Celeste glittering on his arm, their smiles rehearsed for every watching eye. Then the crowd parted. Gasps rippled through the room. Isabella entered, dressed in midnight velvet, her hair pinned like a crown, the silver pendant glinting at her throat. She carried herself not as a ruined bride, but as a woman reborn in fire. Whispers surged. "She dares to come here. How is she still standing?" Adrian's smile faltered. Celeste's grip tightened on his arm, but Isabella did not look at them. She looked beyond them, to the tall figure at the edge of the ballroom, gray eyes fixed on her like an anchor. Damien Knight, no longer in shadows, but revealed in the gilded light of society. He inclined his head once, as though to say, "You are not alone." Isabella drew a breath, her heart steady. The battle had only begun, but tonight the war was no longer hers to fight alone. And as Adrian's gaze flickered nervously toward Damien, Isabella understood something chilling. Adrian feared him, and men like Adrian only feared what they could not control. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and polished marble, but beneath the golden glow, tension crackled like lightning waiting to strike. Isabella moved through the crowd with her head high, each step deliberate, velvet gown whispering across the floor. Whispers chased her like hounds, yet she did not falter. Tonight was no longer about shame. Tonight she was fire walking into a house of lies. Adrian's confident mask began to slip as she drew closer. His smile strained, his hand tightened painfully on Celeste's arm, and for the first time Isabella saw the flicker of panic behind his hazel eyes. The man who had humiliated her in front of God and society now looked hunted. Celeste, radiant in sapphire silk, leaned in and hissed something at him, but his gaze remained locked on Isabella as if she carried the ghost of his ruin. Then came the voice that cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "Mr. Cole." It was Damien Knight. He stepped out from the shadows at the far end of the hall, his tall frame commanding silence without effort. His gray eyes were cold steel as they settled on Adrian. For weeks he had remained unseen protector, but now he entered the battlefield openly. The crowd shifted in awe and unease. Damien Knight did not attend parties unless there was blood in the water. Adrian's jaw clenched. "Knight, what are you doing here? This is a private celebration." Damien's tone was quiet, yet every syllable carried. "Celebrating what?" "A debt disguised as devotion. A woman bought to cover the holes in your crumbling empire." The words fell like stones into the glittering silence. Gasps rippled through the guests. Celeste's face tightened, her painted smile frozen. Adrian's mask shattered. "Lies," he spat, but his voice cracked under the weight of truth. Isabella stood still, letting the spectacle unfold. She felt the silver pendant warm against her skin, as if reminding her that strength was no longer borrowed but earned. She turned to the guests, her voice clear and unwavering. Let him deny it if he dares. Let him swear before you all that his father's debts were not erased by Celeste Monroe's fortune. Let him say I was not cast aside like broken glass to save his name. The crowd erupted into whispers. Investors and old friends shifted uncomfortably, some already calculating losses, others staring at Adrian with disgust. The gilded mask of the Cole family was cracking in real time. Adrian's face burned red. Enough, Isabella, you don't know what you're talking about. But his voice lacked conviction. Damien moved closer, his presence a quiet storm. She knows enough, he said. And so does every man in this room who ever trusted you with a contract. How many of those debts did you bury? How many partners did you betray? Adrian lunged as if to silence Damien, but Damien's hand rose calmly and the gesture alone froze him. Behind them, security guards hesitated, waiting for orders, but none came. Celeste tore her arm free and hissed, "You fool! You couldn't even hide it one night." Isabella's heart pounded as she watched Adrian crumble. This was the man who had left her shattered at the altar. Now he stood trembling, exposed before the same eyes that once pitied her. The power had shifted, and she felt it surge through her veins. Then, in the stunned silence that followed, Damien did something no one expected. He turned toward Isabella, lowered himself slowly to one knee, and in front of the city that had laughed at her ruin, he spoke with quiet force. "Isabella Hart, the world tried to break you." He looked into her eyes, steady and unflinching. "But I have loved you in silence for years. Tonight I refuse to remain silent. Will you allow me the honor of standing at your side, not as your shadow, but as your future?" The ballroom froze. Gasps broke like waves. Adrian staggered back as if struck. Isabella's breath caught, her heart slamming against her ribs. She looked down at Damien Knight kneeling before her, the man the city feared most, offering her not protection in the shadows, but his life in the light. The gala that had been meant to crown Adrian and Celeste ended in stunned silence, with every eye fixed on Isabella as the weight of choice and destiny pressed upon her. The ballroom stood still, breathless, as Damien remained on one knee before Isabella. His words still hung in the air like thunder that refused to fade. Isabella's chest tightened. 100 eyes burned into her, waiting for her response. Some gleamed with envy, others with disbelief. But all of Savannah leaned forward to witness history turn. Adrian's face was ashen, his jaw twitching as if each second of silence sliced into him. Celeste's nails dug into his arm, fury flashing in her sapphire eyes. "Answer him," she whispered harshly, but Isabella's thoughts spun too fast for speech. Her mind reeled back to the cathedral, to vows shattered, to white petals scattered on marble like snow. She remembered humiliation, whispers, cruelty. And then she saw Damien kneeling before her, not offering pity but respect. Not a chain, but a choice. Her lips parted, her voice trembling, yet strong enough to cut the silence. "You asked to stand in the light with me when others hid me in shadows. You offer honor when others gave me shame." She placed her hand gently on the silver pendant at her throat. "I do not know what tomorrow holds, Damien Knight. But tonight, I say yes." The ballroom erupted. Gasps, cries, shouts of disbelief collided like crashing waves. Champagne glasses toppled. Conversations broke into chaos. Half the guests surged closer to catch every word while the other half whispered like vipers, already calculating the scandal. Damien rose smoothly, his hand finding hers with a certainty that steadied her heart. For the first time in months, Isabella felt a strange calm. A storm had carried her here, but at his side she no longer trembled. Adrian's voice shattered the moment. "This is madness." He shoved through the crowd, his face twisted with rage. "You think you can erase me? You think you can humiliate me in my own house?" His words dripped with venom, but the tremor in his voice betrayed his fear. Damien's eyes turned cold steel. "You humiliated yourself, Adrian. You built your empire on lies and debts." Tonight the mask fell. Celeste yanked free of Adrian's grip, her voice sharp as broken glass. "I did not marry a man, I married a ruin." She turned her back on him, her jewels flashing as she walked away, leaving Adrian exposed and alone. The crowd buzzed louder, a frenzy of whispers and recording devices as guests realized the Cole legacy was collapsing before their eyes. Investors murmured about contracts. Socialites plotted invitations withdrawn. The wolves of society circled their wounded prey. Adrian lunged toward Isabella, his voice desperate. "You can't do this. You carry my child." The words split the air like a blade. The crowd gasped, shock rippling outward. Isabella froze, fury and fear surging together. He dared to use her secret against her. Damien stepped forward instantly, his presence towering. "The child she carries is not your shield." His voice struck like iron. "And if you ever threaten her or her child again, I will bury what's left of your empire myself." Adrian's breath hitched, the last of his arrogance crumbling. For the first time, he looked small, pitiful before the man who had replaced him. Isabella lifted her chin, her voice clear enough for every guest to hear. "This child will be born into love, not into your lies. Whatever power you had over me ended at the altar." Thunderous applause broke from one corner of the room, then another, until half the ballroom clapped, whether from genuine respect or fear of Damien's gaze. The tide had turned. Adrian Cole was no longer master of the night. Isabella Hart stood crowned in defiance, and Damien Knight had just rewritten the story of her life. But even as she stood there, her hand in Damien's, the chill of Adrian's words lingered. He would not disappear quietly. A man stripped of power was often more dangerous than one who possessed it, and as the night closed, she knew the battle was far from over. The gala was over, but Savannah woke the next morning aflame with scandal. Newspapers carried headlines about the broken Cole empire. Social circles buzzed about the woman who had risen from humiliation to accept the hand of the city's most mysterious millionaire. Some called Isabella brave, others reckless, but all agreed she was no longer a victim. She was power wrapped in velvet. Adrian, however, did not vanish into silence. Stripped of Celeste's fortune and mocked by his own allies, he grew desperate. Those who once toasted him now turned their backs, but a desperate man becomes a dangerous man. In dim back rooms, Adrian whispered of revenge. He swore Isabella would pay for choosing Damien, swore he would take back control of the empire he believed was his birthright. Isabella felt the weight of his anger before long. Anonymous letters arrived at her door, filled with threats written in a hand she knew too well. At the market, whispers turned darker, some muttering that she had bewitched Damien, others that her child was cursed. A storm of lies gathered around her, and though she stood tall, fear gnawed at her when night fell. Damien saw the shadows closing in. His men uncovered traces of Adrian meeting with dangerous creditors, men who thrived on ruin and blood. Adrian was bargaining with wolves, offering them access to whatever remained of the Cole holdings if they helped him destroy Isabella's name. Damien's jaw hardened as the reports came in. Adrian was no longer fighting for pride. He was waging war. One evening, Isabella sat in the candlelit kitchen, rocking Aurora as the baby slept, when Damien entered with news that chilled the air. "Adrian has forged documents claiming you tried to blackmail him. He's bribed 2 witnesses to testify against you. If this reaches the courts, it could stain your name beyond repair." Isabella's chest tightened, but her eyes burned with fire. "He tried to erase me at the altar and failed. He tried to break me with whispers and failed. If he thinks lies will bury me now, then he underestimates how far I've come." Damien's gaze softened as he looked at her, a strange mixture of admiration and something deeper. "You don't have to face this alone anymore. Let me carry it with you." But Isabella shook her head. "This is my fight too, for my child, for every woman who's been told she is powerless." Days later, the trap was sprung. Adrian staged a press gathering, inviting reporters with promises of revelation. He appeared gaunt, but burning with manic energy. He spoke of betrayal, of Isabella using her pregnancy as a weapon, of Damien Knight being manipulated by a scheming woman who once wore white lace. Murmurs spread through the crowd. For a moment, it seemed his poison might work. Until Damien stepped forward. He did not shout. He simply handed a stack of papers to the lead reporter. These are Adrian Cole's real accounts, debts hidden under false names, payments to silence creditors, bribes to city officials, proof of every lie he has ever lived. Gasps tore through the crowd as journalists flipped pages, eyes widening with each revelation. Adrian's face drained of blood. "This is slander," he shouted, but no one listened. The walls he had built to protect himself cracked under the weight of truth. Isabella moved to Damien's side, her voice steady. "You tried to bury me, Adrian, but instead you buried yourself. And now the world knows who you really are." The press swarmed, flashes burst like lightning, and Adrian stumbled back into the shadows of his own ruin. For Isabella, the moment was both victory and warning. Adrian was cornered, but cornered men bite hardest. That night, as she laid Aurora in her crib, Isabella whispered a vow into the still air. Whatever storm came next, she would endure it. But deep inside, she felt it. The storm was not finished. The most dangerous chapter was yet to come. The city thought Adrian Cole was finished. His empire shattered, his debts exposed, his name dragged through the newspapers until even his oldest allies refused to answer his calls. But a man with nothing left can be the most dangerous of all. Adrian did not disappear quietly into the ruins of his shame. He planned one final strike, and he aimed it directly at Isabella. It happened on a night when Savannah glittered with celebration. Damien had arranged a charity gala in Isabella's honor, presenting her not as a woman scorned but as a symbol of resilience and rebirth. The ballroom overflowed with laughter, music, and the scent of gardenias. Isabella moved gracefully among the guests, Aurora in her grandmother's arms, her smile radiant, though her heart never fully relaxed. She had learned storms could come when the night seemed calmest. Damien stayed near her, his gray eyes scanning the room, every instinct honed for danger. He knew Adrian was cornered, and cornered men never surrendered. They struck from the shadows. The music shifted to a softer tune, and Damien offered Isabella his hand. For a moment the world shrank to just the two of them as they glided across the floor. Her gown shimmered like midnight silk, her head resting lightly near his chest. The crowd faded. She felt, for the first time since the cathedral, truly safe. Then the lights flickered. A murmur rippled through the guests. The grand doors at the end of the hall slammed open. Adrian stood there, disheveled, eyes burning with a feverish desperation. His voice cracked through the music like a blade. "You all think I'm ruined. You think she won. But tonight you will see the truth." Gasps filled the air as Adrian strode forward, pulling a revolver from his coat. The orchestra fell silent. Guests screamed, stumbling back, glasses shattering on the floor. Adrian's shaking hand pointed directly at Isabella. "You took everything from me. My fortune, my name, my life. If I cannot rise again, then neither will you." Isabella froze, but Damien stepped in front of her instantly, his broad frame shielding her completely. His voice was calm, even as the gun glinted in the chandelier's light. "You've already lost, Adrian. Put it down before you lose what little remains of your soul." Adrian laughed, a hollow sound that echoed through the marble hall. "You think you've saved her night? But I know the truth. You loved her in secret for years while I had her. You envied me. Well, now you can die with her." The crowd gasped. Whispers surged like fire. Loved her in secret. The revelation hung heavy in the air, but Damien did not deny it. His voice rang out strong. "Yes, I loved her in silence because she deserved better than your arrogance and deceit. I loved her from the shadows because I would never wound her pride, and tonight I will not let you harm her." Adrian's finger tightened on the trigger. Isabella felt her breath stop. But before the shot could fire, Damien moved like lightning. He lunged, grabbing Adrian's wrist, twisting it with brutal precision. The gun clattered across the marble floor. Gasps erupted as men rushed forward, restraining Adrian as he fought like a cornered animal. His screams filled the hall until security dragged him out, his empire collapsing with the last shreds of his dignity. The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes turned back to Isabella and Damien. He stood before her, breathing hard, his suit torn where Adrian had struggled against him. Yet his gaze was only for her. No more shadows, Isabella. No more silence. He dropped to one knee again, not before society this time, but before her heart. I loved you when the world mocked you. I loved you when you thought you stood alone. And I will spend the rest of my life proving that love is not betrayal but salvation. Tears blurred Isabella's vision. She remembered white petals falling at the altar, remembered humiliation burning her skin like fire. But she also remembered the storm when Aurora was born, Damien standing in the doorway like a vow given flesh, the nights he kept her safe when the world wanted her broken. She bent down, took his face in her hands, and whispered through tears. Yes, Damien Knight. Yes. The ballroom erupted with applause and cries of joy. Aurora stirred in Eleanor's arms, her tiny voice rising as though she too felt the shift of destiny. Isabella no longer stood as the girl abandoned at the altar. She stood as a mother, a survivor, and a woman who had been chosen not out of pity but out of love that had endured in silence until it could shine. Outside, the cathedral bells rang, not for betrayal this time, but for rebirth. Adrian Cole would vanish into disgrace, a warning written into Savannah's history. But Isabella Hart's name would live on, not as a victim, but as the woman who rose from ruin to claim a love stronger than wealth and brighter than vengeance. And as Damien wrapped her in his arms, his voice low and certain against her ear, she knew the war was over. You will never stand alone again.